Hello. Let's move on to the second half of Thoughts About Colossus, The Price of America's Empire by Neil Ferguson. Hopefully this bit will go a little faster, because I've already covered several of the ideas that he talks about here in my rambling speech. So chapter 5, he makes the case for liberal empire. Essentially what he's going to argue, the author, what he is going to argue is that liberal empires are good in certain ways. That we live in a world of unipolar power, and sometimes we've lived in a world of multipolar power. And long ago in the past, we lived in a world of non-polar power. And a question arises, which world are we heading towards again? Okay. One thing it talks about here, right? Although only around a quarter of the American continent, mainly Canada, found itself in the same condition of dependence, nearly all the rest have been ruled from Europe at one time or another in the 17th and 18th centuries. In both the North and the South, the policies of the American republics were fundamentally shaped by the colonial past. And that's something I don't really think about very often, that the United States of America itself was a colony. Not a colony in the sense of being some natives ruled by an outside power, right? But a colony in the sense that colonialism, that way of life, that manner of existence, that series of trade, that mindset going on, affects the United States too, even at an early age. That the United States is a result of colonialism. And I think it's not often that I think about how colonialism affected everybody, not only the colonies, in Africa and Asia and South America and North America and so on, but also the countries that were the colonizers: England, France, Germany, Italy, Belgium, as well as those few caught in the middle, like China, for example, which, although not directly colonized, still suffers the effects of it. And we usually think of colonialism as totally negative. It's like, oh, totally bad. It's evil Europeans and the all innocent natives who are being exploited. But it's not always that simple. A lot of colonial activity was such that local elites took advantage of the opportunity. The colonial system in the Americas differs markedly from the colonial system in Africa, not least because we think, at least, that huge, vast numbers of the Native Americans in the American continent died because of disease, particularly. And also you had large slave-holding plantations, especially in the Caribbean, which affects how these countries exist afterwards. Asia is another interesting case in that in many ways it follows the same events that take place in Africa. The difference being that there are also some stronger states in Asia which at least partially resist European colonialization. And how do we see this in a more neutral sense? Like, what was the effect in general? And what he's trying to make the case for here, that it was, yes, negative, and terror and death and political usurpations and leaving behind a legacy of taking resources away and so on. But there are more complicated effects. Okay. As it points out here, The coming of political independence has brought prosperity only to a small minority of former colonized. The coming of political independence has brought prosperity only to a small minority of former colonies. And although the former imperial powers no longer fight one another, decolonization has in many cases been followed by recurrent conflict between newly independent states, and even more often within them. This has been the great double disappointment of the 60 years since the end of World War II. Nor has the disappointment ended there. Self-determination was supposed to go hand in hand with democracy. But decolonization is often led not to democracy, but, after the briefest of interludes, to indigenous dictatorship. And then it makes a claim, which I not having lived in... Have I lived in... Okay, I have lived, several months in some of these colonies. But I, not having grown up and learned the history of these nations that these people understand in their own way, not having studied this in an academic sense, I can only repeat the claims made, and it's hard for me to judge the absolute validity of them. Although what this book does is, like I think many academic books, it tends to focus on a certain thing. In this case, it's going to focus on dictatorships and economics. Okay. And the claim it makes is, many of these dictatorships have been worse for the people living under them than the old colonial structures of government. More corrupt, more lawless, more violent. Indeed, it is precisely these characteristics that explain why standards of living had actually worsened in many sub-Saharan African countries since they gained their independence. Colonialism was not all good, of course, and independence has not been all bad. But it is not convincing, although it is certainly convenient for people like the likes of the Zimbabwean despot Robert Mugabe. But it is not convincing, although it is convenient, to blame all the problems of the developing world today on the malign after effects of colonial rule. In the words of Africa's Development Bank's 2003 report, more than 4 decades of independence should have been enough time to sort out the colonial legacies and move forward. The experience of much of Africa and the Middle East since 1945, as large parts of Asia, makes it clear that Roosevelt's faith in decolonization was misplaced. Right? Like, there are colonies, former colonies, which have come out of it and become wonderful success stories, right? At least comparatively. I would say something like, based on, let's see, where I've been, Vietnam has been a success story. Malaysia has been a success story. In Indonesia, at least parts of Indonesia has been successful. And I think you could make a case for, of course, the Gulf states with their oil, as well as several African countries. If you look at a map of conflict zones in Africa, then South Africa not doing so well, the Sudan not doing so well, Niger and Chad not doing so great. But Kenya and Egypt, as well as Morocco to an extent, I've seen YouTube videos, right? You look at like the Gambia, for example, have done relatively well, and that you, just based on, of course, me not being there, right? But based on maps and data that I can read from far away as a barely educated American student about this, seem to have turned out quite okay for the people living there. On the other hand, you have lots of stories about this dictator or that dictator rising up and seeming to be fine for a while, but unfortunately they hold on for too long, and you have dictators in their 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s taking over, and they begin to lose their grip. They begin to lose their head. They have to focus more and more on the crony system. They don't succeed in making the changes they said they would achieve, because to make those changes, it turns out, would involve them losing their grip on power, and they aren't willing to do that. They end up benefiting themselves over others. You even have issues in like functioning democracies like South Africa, where there is, political capture of power companies, for example. Then you go to South America and Mexico, very successful, relatively speaking. Many people's lives have been bettered, but there's also this persistent crime problem they've had for many years. You look at Colombia and you hear, well, certain cities are fine, other cities not so great. You look at Venezuela, you look at Brazil, and you're going, well, it's gotten better, but you also have horrible stories coming out of it. Of course, the same thing can be said about the United States. We have benefited most obviously from decolonization, I would say, because we opened up trade, because we are the superpower, right? Because if you are a dictator trying to hold on to power, if the United States is in support of you at all, this can be very helpful. If the United States, like one of the attempts of the United States to change policies ended up being very helpful. China, for example, the idea was that by opening up China to international trade, by accepting the switch to capitalism with Chinese characteristics, you end up changing the politics by changing the force that private property has in their system based on, who owns and the wealth and whatnot. And this did not succeed in overthrowing the Chinese Communist Party, obviously, for many, many reasons. But it was beneficial to China, for sure. Although you have other places where it's much more debatable. I mean, how many Caribbean countries has the U.S. invaded or changed, especially during the Cold War, when the U.S. would involve itself? Last time we covered several mentions, like the island of Grenada, I think, in 1993 or 91 or something. Okay. And so, also, the problem I think this book might have is, how do you find out the information? How extensive is your testing as regards living quality in 1932 Ghana versus now? How much information can you actually get? And are you looking at 1932, 1945, 1984? How much of this is due to decolonization and independence? How much of this is due to the borders of African countries? I read a book once that said some of the problems that former colonies in Africa particularly had was not necessarily the tribal boundaries being mixed up, but instead it was the result of the colonialist economy had been such that wealth was extremely concentrated in towns, and that today many African states have their population extremely concentrated in small towns, or extremely concentrated around the capital, or at least the wealth is extremely concentrated around the capital, and most of the other country is empty. So you have this ongoing battle between, farmers and herders that has existed for almost ever. and so on. Right. And she's going to point out money here, but that's not all the story, right? It says the two things are immediately apparent from Table 6, which compares both sets of countries in 1913 and 1998. The first is that only one former colony significantly improved its relative economic position, Singapore, which in 1913 had a per capita GDP of a quarter of that of the US, but which by 1998 had overtaken all the former European imperial powers. The other ex-colony to improve its position, Malaysia, has done so only modestly, raising per capita GDP from 17% to 26% of the American level. All the others have fallen far behind the United States than they were in 1913, in some cases very far behind. In 1913, the Philippines, Egypt, India, Vietnam, Ghana, and Burma all had per capita GDP of 13 to 20% of the American level. In 1998, the average income in all six was less than a tenth of the average U.S. income. By comparison, all the former empires have remained within sight of the world's economic leader, with the exception of the United Kingdom, which is distinctly worse off in relative terms than it was in 1913. So there's lots of information there, right? So he's going to say, India comparatively has less GDP per person in 1913 than it does in 1998. So it's fallen behind. But does it? But we can look at we can look at, for example, the absolute growth in purchasing power parity terms, right? Maybe the United States has just grown so fast that even though India is growing at a reasonable rate, the average person in India makes 3 times what they did in 1913. The average person in the US makes, 50 times what they did in 1913. And I don't know that for sure. I'm just saying that there are more facts to look at in this table than the table itself gives us. As well, you have to ask how much of a cause for someplace like India or Burma or Vietnam or the Philippines having internal problems or economic difficulties, or they don't grow very fast, how much of that is due to former wealth? Britain started a whole lot richer than the Philippines in 1913, as well as things like the effects or actions taken by those former empires. Right? There's a state, I want to say, there's a state in the Caribbean, a former state. It was peopled by slaves who rebelled against Britain, I think, or France. Rebelled against France, and then agreed to pay a debt to France because they had, taken the property of French nobles, the French elite, by freeing the slaves, and that took 100 years to pay off a debt, right? So that does not help this little island in the Caribbean grow. You can also look at, like, Iran. Okay, how much of Iran's growth issues are due to the sanctions? How much of that is due to U.S. interference earlier on? How much of that is due to the tug of war between the Soviet Union and the U.S.? Like, you look at, I want to say, Egypt, and there was a big hubbub over the Aswan Dam. Egypt wanted to build the Aswan Dam. The United States said it would pay for it, and then it said it wouldn't. And then the Soviet Union agreed to pay for it, and that put the Aswan Dam's construction behind, I'm sure, by several years. It may have changed the plans or the quality, right? It may have had an effect upon the political stability of Egypt, and so on and so on, right? There's no simple action here. So the case it's making is basically saying, look, all these colonies, and a lot of them just haven't grown as much as we hoped they would. They're just consistently behind. And he's saying that, and a liberal empire would help with that, right? He's saying that that once America becomes a superpower, we should expect to see these colonies growing faster, because what helps economic growth? Starting capital, political stability, and a clear knowledge of the rules. If you know the rules of trade, if you know that you have to do certain things in order to get your goods into the United States and sell them and then get the money back to where you are and build something else, right? If you know that your electricity is going to be stable, if you know that you can trade your rubles for American dollars, and your American dollars for yuan, and your yuan for Brazilian reals, and then reals for the Mexican peso, and then the peso back to dollars, and then back to the euro and so on. If you know you can do this and move money around, then you can grow international trade. You can buy from foreign places and so on. If, however, there is not an agreement about this, if you don't know the rules of trade, if there's no large agreement over food safety, and you have to put a different label on every single bag of chips you sell to all 30 of these different countries, that raises your costs and so on. So stability is good for growth because people can take advantage of it. On the other hand, if there's a bunch of instability, this cuts down on growth because it raises the risk. It raises the cost likelihood of failure. Okay. It says the experiment with political independence, especially in Africa, has been a disaster for most poor countries. Life expectancy in Africa has been declining and now stands at just 47 years. This is despite aids, loans, and programs of debt forgiveness. Only 2 sub-Saharan countries out of 46, Botswana and Mauritius, have bucked the trend of economic failure. Why have so many newly independent countries failed so badly to achieve economic growth? And it goes on. The real problem of the early 21st century is not globalization, but its absence or inhibition. Indeed, the sad truth about globalization is that it is not truly global at all. Part of the problem is that world trade is still far from being truly free. At least some of this blame can be laid at the door of the world's richest countries, which continue to pay subsidies to their farmers equivalent to the entire GDP of Africa. American producer support still amounts to around 20% of gross farm receipts. The EU, 30%. To give a single example, the subsidies paid to American cotton producers reduced the value of cotton exports from Benin, Mali, Chad, and Burkina Faso by $250 million a year, equivalent to nearly 3% of their combined national income. But it is not just rich countries that are at fault. Many poor countries have hedged their economies around with a bewildering variety of restrictions that tend to hamper commerce. It has been convincingly shown that one of the principal reasons for widening international inequality in the 70s and 80s was, in fact, protectionism in less developed economies. Comparison of per capita GDP among developing countries found the more open economies grew at an annual rate of 4.5%, while the closed countries managed barely 0.7%. A similar point can be made with respect to flows of labor. The more free movement there is of labor, the more international income levels tend to converge. Consider the evidence on international capital flows. And theoretically, capital should flow from rich countries to poor countries because it's easier to start from a lower base. Right? Land, for example, is cheaper. If you have to build a factory in the United States, it's going to cost you hundreds of millions of dollars just to buy the land before you even begin to put down brick on brick for the factory. However, if you want to go to Chad and buy enough land for a factory, a lot cheaper. So theoretically, money should be going to places like Chad, right, where it is cheaper land, cheaper labor, looser environmental regulations, for example. But what this is saying is this hasn't really happened. In fact, China has benefited the most from this sort of activity. And why is China benefited? It's large and powerful, of course, but he's going to say that mostly it is because China is stable, politically stable. You know what you're going to get. Whereas if you're working with Burkina Faso, the rules may change in 2 or 3 years. Right? And then it says, the very poorest countries nowadays receive almost no investment from abroad. Most cross-border capital flows are in fact among the US, the EU, and Japan. Quite simply, investors in rich countries prefer to invest in other rich countries. And he says, geography and climate can be a explanation for some of these. For example, sub-Saharan Africa, not a lot of ports, not a lot of navigable rivers. It's farther away from places where you're trying to sell your goods. Like if you're trying to sell your goods in the United States, it's harder to get them from Africa to the US than it is from the EU to the US, for example. And you look at, like, say you're raising food in Africa. Well, if you're raising food anywhere around the Sahel region, then due to weather patterns, the optimum growth possibilities will literally shift from, year to year as rainfall moves up and down the latitudes of the Sahel. Right? So if you're going to grow food, you're going to grow food in some place like the Ohio River Valley, in some place like the plains of China, in some place like India, which receives a relatively consistent monsoons. You're not going to grow a lot of food in sub-Saharan Africa. You're not going to do much in sub-Saharan Africa because it's far away, political instability. I mean, shoot, if you want to ship things out, what do you have, like 4 ports on the entire southern half of the continent that you can fit a major cargo ship into, right? One of the things that makes the U.S. particularly a powerhouse in growing food is the port of Los Angeles and the Erie Canal, which opens up all of Southern California to easy shipping of food, as well as the entire Ohio River Valley can now ship food out through the ocean. It doesn't have to go over land. It's much cheaper, and so on. I don't know if we still do a lot of that, but historically, that made a huge difference. Right? I mean, imagine what the Mississippi does for the United States economy, and compare that to something like the Congo. Totally different level of transportation available. But it gets complicated, right? To what extent is it the political issues? To what extent is it that, Africa has lots of natural resources, but if it is cheap to ship, if moving goods around the planet is very cheap because you have technology and, oil-based ships and whatnot, then it may be worth it to dig the gold or the silver or the lithium or wherever out of Chile or Africa and ship it to China or Europe or the United States to have it processed. Now, theoretically, it should be cheaper to build the factory in, Chile or South Africa or Malaysia, because you don't have to transport your items so far. But this will depend on the cost of transportation. If it's really, really difficult, then you have to build the factory. But it may be just more efficient otherwise. And then depending on how complex your items are, right? Like, say you have lithium, right? No, say you're producing iron, right? You have an iron block, you have a ton of iron. Okay. Well, it turns out you can ship it to Shenzhen, and there's like 30,000 different factories that can use that chunk of iron. Right. And now you could, if you're a company, go and build your car making plant or whatever that uses iron parts, uses steel parts, and you could get a series of factories that take the iron, make it into steel, shape it into the correct forms, and then take it to the car factory and stamp it, and then take it, and then paint it, and so on. Or you could get one car factory that takes standardized metal plates and shapes them, and that's all it does. Much, much cheaper investment. And if you're going to put that somewhere, you're going to put it in, Cleveland or something. Now, if it's almost impossible to get your iron plates there, then you have a difficulty. But if you can get your standardized steel plates there, and you're shipping them from anywhere, be cheaper, right? Like it has to do with the cost of production for various items, right? If you're shipping the steel plates from China, and you're buying, and those steel plates are made from ore mined in Spain, right? Well, that's a lot of travel time and a lot of travel distance, but also if you're building a steel making factory in Spain, huge investment, maybe there's not many other places that will use it, right? Can you swiftly change and tool what you're doing? Is electricity cheap? All these things add up. Is labor cheap? What sort of rules are people following? And so on. And you have large problems with corruption. Can also cause a difficulty. Is there likely to be political instability? Is someone going to nationalize you because they decide to turn from capitalist to communist? Okay. And he says, in The Wealth and Poverty of Nations, David Landis summed this view by postulating the ideal growth and development government would: A, secure rights of private property to encourage saving and investment, secure rights and private and personal liberty against tyranny and crime and corruption, enforce rights of contract, provide stable government, governed by publicly known rules, provide responsive government, provide honest government with no rents to favor imposition, provide moderate and efficient, ungreedy government. So, secure private property, make sure the laws are clear, don't cause a lot of civil rights issues because that causes instability in your political instability in your country. Right. Democracy in the sense of universal suffrage-based legislators is not indispensable for growth. Witness China, Malaysia, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, and Thailand. But it does point out authoritarian regimes in China have fared well economically, but most of the rest of the world has not. So why do authoritarian regimes in China tend to work economically, but authoritarian regimes in Africa are dirt poor? How much of that is colonization? How much of that is culture? How much of that is geography? How much of that is the result of political instability? And it doesn't have to be your political instability. It can be the political instability of the countries around you. So what this book argues is, if you have a big bully like the United States enforcing contract rights, enforcing peace, then places should grow faster. And he basically says that without the threat of a large superpower, countries will tend to fight each other. Look at Pakistan and India, who have been squabbling for 85 years. Look at Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Turkey. Look at Israel and Palestine, right? Look at... There have been several wars in South America that I know of. A lot of wars in Africa. Look at the Balkans, right? You have ancient conflicts. Look at any period in history, from the Roman Empire to the Greeks and the Persians, to the Mongol hordes, to the British and the French to, let's see, the Mongols and the Chinese, the Xiongnu and the Chinese. You look at India, you're going to see lots of little tiny principalities going on. So on. That if you have many small countries are vulnerable to a larger country coming in and attacking them. So if you have one big fish and a lot of small fish, the big fish tends to eat up the small fish. Whereas if you have a few big fish, they will push against each other and you'll have wars on the periphery, a la the US and the Soviet Union. Lots of Cold Wars on the periphery, but it could be argued that the majority of people grow richer and healthier even during this time. The areas that are relatively safe from conflict behind the border. And then the idea it also points forth is, if you've got a big brother standing behind you, then the big brother might be interested in your political stability, might be interested in your economic growth, might be very friendly sometimes, might give you good terms simply because A, they can afford it, and B, they want you to remain their friend, right? If you are a small country in the Middle East during the Cold War, what are you doing? You are not taking sides. You're saying, well, I'm not really with the US. I'm not really with the USSR. I'm like the third world. I'm in between these two. And I'll play them off against each other, trying to see which one benefits me more in each particular moment, while at the same time keeping an eye on my back for them to knife me. But it says, at 180, says Western countries gave away $1 trillion in transfers to poor countries between 1950 and 1995. These efforts have yielded pitiful results, in large measure because the recipient countries lack the political, legal, and financial institutions necessary for aid to be productive. Arbitrary and corrupt rulers bear a large share of the responsibility for this economic failure. And this is interesting here. It says, much of the money that is poured into poor countries has simply leaked back out. One study of 30 sub-Saharan African countries calculated that total capital flight from the period 1970 to 1996 was in the region of $187 billion, which, when accrued interest is added, applies that Africa's ruling elites had private overseas assets equivalent to 145% of the public debts their country is owed. The authors conclude that roughly 80 cents on every dollar borrowed by African countries flowed back as capital flight in the same year. And there seems to be a close correlation between sub-Saharan economic failure and the generalized absence of the rule of law and political accountability. If you are in a corrupt society, and if a corrupt government ruled by a dictator, it turns out that what they will do is not invest in their own countries. Because if you are a dictator in charge of a country, you do not want your people in your country to be powerful and rich. Why? Because then they will try to challenge you. They will have their own private interests, their own private funds that they will try to use to protect themselves, to become a voice in government, to be against you. So no dictator on the planet wants their people to be rich. Okay? So a dictator has a vested interest. A small... very small government run by a few people or by one family, or run by the military, for example, has a very vested interest in making their country poor, okay, and having lots of resources kept to themselves. And they're also going to, so they're going to take the money because they're in charge. So you're going to loan money to the Congo, right? Go loan money to Rwanda. And someone's going to take it. They're going to say, oh, thank you very much. I will distribute this to the citizens for you. I'll make sure it goes to good places. And they're going to take 80% of that. Some of it they're going to use to build a palace in their next to the river, next to the Congo, and some of it they're going to take and they're going to shove it back to Switzerland in a secret Swiss bank account, just in case one day they have to leave the country. Right? You look at Syria and Bashar al-Assad, he flies out and he's still rich. Why? Because he took a bunch of his money and he hid it in other places. So that if one day he has to leave Syria, he still has funds. And this is bad for the country of Syria. This is bad for the country where this happens. And so I think it's something to really look out for. If there's someone rising up and saying, give me all the power, elect me dictator for life, give me the support of the military and the people, and let me break the rule of law because I will fix things for you, then one of two things happens, right? Either they are a saint, they are a Cincinnatus, they're a Washington, and I will take my power, I will get it, and then I will give it up and I will leave because this was enough for me. Or, far, far, far more likely, they will get the power, and then they will say, I couldn't fix all of it, give me more power, give me more, give me more, give me more, until they have all the power. Because it turns out that in order to fix it, in order to fix a corrupt and tangled country, what you actually have to do is work with the stakeholders, right? You have to work with the people, work with the merchants, work with the army, work with everyone who has a voice, and allow them to rise up to a certain level so that you can debate back and forth with them, because that gets them to work for you and work with you. That book on taxes I was going over covered some of this, right? You can raise taxes higher in a democracy than you can in a dictatorship. Because in a democracy, people will say, I understand what I'm paying for, and I'm willing to pay in order to attain this benefit from the government, in order for the government to do this thing, in order to defend our land of England against the Spanish Armada. I'm willing to pay more than I would if you had whips and brands and were docking me and counting the windows in my house. So that what we should see theoretically is a functioning democratic government being more powerful and more stable than a dictatorial government. This is all in just pure economic theory, right? A pure stakeholder political theory. That if people work together, then they stand together. They fall apart and all go in different directions, and it's everybody for my own, then you end up in a state of nature, and nature is red in tooth and claw. Someone ends up enforcing the law by fire and sword, spending all their time making swords and feeding the fire, instead of improving the heart and limiting their desire. It says here, according to the African Union, the costs of corruption are equivalent to around 1/4 of African GDP. Okay, like, do you understand how much that is? 1/4 of African GDP is used to cover the cost of corruption. You want to build a business, but you got to give money to this person, and that person, and that person, and this person, and you got to have a meeting, and you got to pull the money out in gold coins or something, right? And it has to be untraceable, and all this costs time. It's not just paying a fine to the government. It's not just applying for a license and following through. No, you have to convince people. You have to make them like you or trust you. You have to work with 1,000 little tiny family groups. You have to deal with the fact that these countries become politically unstable over time. If you have a entity that is strong enough, then corruption just takes the place of a functioning government, right? That is, if I'm paying fines, well, then if the government is strong enough, then a corruption just means I'm paying fines to a particular group, like the House of Saud, for example. in Saudi Arabia. Like if I'm dealing with corruption and it turns out that the royal family is so much in charge, then corruption is just government work. Okay, so in a strong centralized area, corruption is just the cost of doing government work, right? If you're in Russia and Putin is in control of everything and he requires a bribe to get something done, well, then that's not a bribe so much as it is the cost of doing business with the government. You may as well just pay a license. And theoretically, this should be matched by lower costs in other ways, so that the cost of building a factory in Russia, for example, versus building a factory in France, if their rules are both consistent, they should even out over time, the cost incurred upon you. But in a country which is in any way whatsoever fractured, in a country where you're not paying bribes to one group, but instead of paying bribes to many, many groups or to many, many small officials, I have to pay a bribe to this guy to get a meeting with this guy and I'll pay him a bribe to get a meeting with the other person, pay them a bribe to get to the person I actually need to talk to who has the power to make this happen and give them a bribe. And it turns out they'll hire somebody to work with me and it'll be fine, but I'll also have to end up giving a bribe to like 2 contractors and they won't do anything until I give them their bribe. And it takes time. You don't know what's going on because everybody wants their piece and everyone's trying to get their piece and everyone's a little greedy and it just wants a little more. And instead of following the rules, or instead of having one single payer, you have many. It falls apart. So that's what it's saying is happening in Africa. That's why the costs of corruption are so high. And 1/4 of GDP. Imagine if you had to pay that in debt. Imagine if your country spent 25% of its GDP every year on nothing. Right? The US runs a deficit of like 6% GDP. What if we had a deficit of 31% of GDP? And we ran that every year. How fast would we turn dirt poor? The same with corruption. And, this is my personal viewpoint here, but, corruption is the worst thing for a country. It doesn't really matter to a certain extent if your rules are fair or unfair about protectionism or civil rights and all that compared to corruption. Because corruption hides money. Corruption means you don't really know what's going on. Corruption means that the growth of the economy is negative sometimes. Corruption means that there is a culture of secrecy growing, right? And if you have civil rights problems or civil rights violations, then you can fix that, right? People can protest, you can change laws. If you have protectionism going on, right, then that puts a downward pressure on your economy. But as long as those laws are consistently followed, either they work or they don't work, right? Either they grow your economy or they don't grow your economy. One thing or the other is going to happen. And you will be able to look at your rules and the effect that they have and determine. Somebody can do a study and explain to the people in charge that this is bad for us or this is good for us. Right? So someone at least will benefit from a consistent series of rules, whether they be bad rules or not. Corruption, however, means that, hey, I got to get my piece. I got to get my money. And you can't track it. You don't know what's going on. And in order to fix things, then you have to investigate people. And everyone's trying to hide because everyone's corrupt. If you investigate him for corruption, you might investigate me for corruption. And I don't want that. So I'm not going to help you investigate him for corruption. And times that by 10,000. There's been a movement in China, I think, recently to clamp down on corruption, and that's probably one of the best possible things you could do for your economy and your society. This is one of the reasons that the U.S. is relatively uncorrupt as far as the government goes, but it seems to be getting worse. And this is, I think, a very great danger. And every gold brick that shows up in the president's office, I'm going, that is the destruction of the American economy and way of life and rule of law. And then the book makes a very iffy claim, right? In most cases, their only hope for the future would seem to be intervention by a foreign power capable of constructing the basic institutional foundations that are indispensable for economic development. And it names countries: Central African Republic, Uganda, Rwanda, Chad, Tajikistan, Niger, Eritrea, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Burundi, Ethiopia, Congo, Afghanistan, Somalia. He's basically saying, look, we have some countries on the planet that are so politically unstable, the only way to make them stable is outside intervention. This is, how do I say, contentious, to say the least. Contentious to communicate the least information here. Right. You're looking at Tajikistan, for example, as unstable, or Liberia is someplace that is just not improving the quality of life of its residents, or Somalia or Ethiopia, right? And I'm going, well, how much of that is due to their internal squabbles? How much of that is due to the actions of other countries? For example, Rwanda is not assisting the Democratic Republic of Congo in remaining very politically stable right now. There's an invasion going on. So how much of the Congo's instability is its own fault versus the result of economic and military pressures on it? And you also have to ask, how can these countries get out of it, right? Because ideally, if you have a failing country, then what we expect should happen is that you have many, many people fighting, and one of these groups will win out. One of these groups will turn out to be the king. That may happen eventually, but if you can look at Europe, for example, didn't happen. Did not actually happen. You can look at almost any place on the planet, and if there is not an empire, then there are a lot of little states that fight each other all the time. Is basically what this book is saying. And even within a state, you can have tiny power groupings, right? Look at Afghanistan, and there was the Northern Alliance and the Taliban, right? And the Northern Alliance was composed of like 4 different tribes, and the Taliban was and then the Taliban was something else, and then there were Pashtun tribes down south. And then I would hear stories about people who they go in to some village in Afghanistan. They would say, okay, I understand you need to defend yourself against the Taliban. So I'm going to stay here. I'm going to give you guns. I'm going to train you on fighting. And you're going to ally yourselves with the Americans. And then the people of the village would say, thank you very much for your training. We're going to use it to slaughter the village next door, who we have been feuding with for the last 400 years. And you're looking at that and you're going, I can't help you people. Right? I give you money and you're still trapped in the old way of life. Right? I leave you alone and you're still trapped in the old way of life. How do I break the cycle? And the hope of America in the Middle East was that we would go into Iraq and Afghanistan and break this cycle and tell them what to do. However, that didn't work. And I think there's lots of questions to ask. What this book is trying to say is that we didn't straight up own our actions. We didn't straight up go and be like, we will nation build in Afghanistan. Instead, we went to Afghanistan and said, we will help Afghanistan change rulers, and then we'll give some moderate support. But what happens eventually? The old powers reassert themselves, the old troubles. The Taliban rises again. Right? The Taliban was not in charge in the first place because they achieved their victory illegitimately. It turns out they did it very legitimately, except it was in the old way, with fire and sword, with gun and whip. Not with the new way of democracy and voting and agreement and constitutions. We are still in this world of fire and flame, and we have not yet entirely understood the difference that resides in a name. Right? Like, one of the reasons that China and Japan and Thailand exist is because they have existed for a very long time, because they have been more or less unified along certain cultural and political and economic lines. There's a reason that Iran exists today, because it's essentially Persia. There's a reason also that Afghanistan is very new, because you didn't have a great empire that originated from that area. It was just the crossroads of civilization. It's the same in the Levant. It just hasn't had, there was no great power that arose from the lands of Judea. There's never been a great power that arose from the lands of Judea. It's never happened. It's always been controlled. And even when it was a local power, a local strength, very small, weak countries, comparatively. So history has a lot more to do with the world we live in than we expect. And, the American ideal is, hey, we go in, we introduce democracy, we get these people to talk to each other, and then they work it all out, and kumbaya. The American experience is the exact opposite of that. And I don't think we should expect anything differently, especially when we look at the United States itself and how many problems and issues we have and how much we fight among ourselves. We do it with swords and voting, but it's only one small, short step to lynchings and mobs. And these are not old news. This is January 6th, very modern news. This is ice in the streets, very modern news. The old idea of force is very seductive to anyone who cannot convince the entire nation to follow their way of life. So much easier to just beat the enemy upside the head than to talk with them. So much easier to make myself strong and never give anyone else any power. But, I've been reading about civil rights, basically. And one of the ideas is that, in the United States, right? One of the ideas is these people are endowed with inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And, we recognize these as rights. We look at free speech, for example, and recognize that as a right that we have as American citizens. And we tend to think of them as, in the modern day, we tend to think of them as something that is given by a government. We all agreed to respect each other's rights, and that's how these rights come into being. Another way, an older way of looking at these rights, though, is that they happen naturally, right? Like free speech, the right of free speech. Why is that a right? Because you cannot stop people from talking. There is no government power that has ever existed in the history of our planet that can stop people from talking to one another. So either the speech is going to go on behind your back, in secret, among a small group, or you can pull the speech out into the open and allow it to be spoken. Either way, the speech is going to happen, right? It's like life and liberty. Look, you can push down, you can have slavery, right? But there is going to be this push against slavery. Like, there's going to be this yearning, this activation, this movement towards life and liberty. And you can spend all your time fighting it. You can have this corruption going on that costs you growth in GDP, or you can acquiesce and say, this power is always going to be there. Let us deal with it as an equal, as a natural power of human beings that they have intrinsically as human beings. Instead of clamping down on it, let us understand that as long as people exist, they're going to have certain abilities that they exercise or that they attempt to exercise, right? Like you can make your people ignorant as much as you want, but there will always be someone who says, I want to learn more. I want to escape. I want to ask questions. And you can put them in jail, right? You can kill them. You can jail your detractors or your journalists, but some of them will still exist. They'll keep rising up. They'll move to other countries where they'll be safe, and you're always going to have this churn. So why are you spending all this energy clamping down instead of accepting free speech, for example, and then working with it so that all the stakeholders together can push together as one and move this mighty mountain instead of one small person chaining a bunch of oxen and trying to point them in the right direction. But again, I'm a philosophy major. I'm an idealist. And it doesn't always work this way. All right, and then it says, economic openness was imposed by colonial powers on Asian and African countries, but also in South America and even Japan. To be more precise, free trade spread because of Britain's power and Britain's example. It is the first age of Anglo-globalization that we now turn in order to assess both its costs and its benefits. Okay, so basically it says, according to one estimate, the economic benefit to Britain of enforcing free trade could have been anywhere between 1.8 and 6.5% of GNP. But what about the benefit to the rest of the world? The evidence that in an increasingly protectionist world, Britain's continued policy of free trade was beneficial to its colonies seems unequivocal. Basically, it's saying, look, we know from studies that free trade is good for economic growth. And we also know that countries will tend to be protectionist. They will say they will raise tariffs. They will have strong laws. Why do they do this? Because there are established powers already in that country that want to stay established powers, right? If you have a large agricultural base that have a lot of political power, and then you open up free trade, all of a sudden food becomes cheaper, and all those farmers make less money than they did before. Now, what happens in free trade is that those farmers make less money than they did before for a short while, and everybody else in the country makes more money, and then eventually the farmers also grow and it all catches up and everything grows as one. But this growth from free trade is preceded by a fall in the economic power of a certain group that has faced protectionism, right? If you go in and you if you have a system that is heavily regulated, like power, for example, or you heavily regulate the phone lines, AT&T, and then you go in and you break up that monopoly, you deregulate the trains or whatnot, then what is going to happen is you have winners and losers. All of a sudden, everybody who was receiving rent because of this protectionism, because of these laws that said you will always make 5% or whatever, all of a sudden it's a free for all, and some people fall, some people die, some companies disappear, other companies grow and become richer, and this is better for the country as a whole, but it is bad for certain companies in those countries for a short time, right? You break up AT&T, you make the little bells, and some of those bells will grow, some of them will shrink, some of them will disappear. Ideally, this competition ends up making improvements in technology, in pricing, in efficiency. But that improvement is preceded by the battle, by the feeding trough, by the losers losing. And that's a huge risk, right? If you are AT&T, before being broken up, you don't want to be broken up because you're saying we're nice, we're safe, we don't want to take the risk of me. Like if I'm a boss in AT&T, I don't want to take the risk that my little bell, once we're broken up, is going to be a victor. Much safer to just take my 5% rent that the monopoly given to me by the government assures me. This isn't true for everybody. There's some people who would say, I want to be a fish. I want to be a shark. I want to go out and win against these other companies. I think I can do good and great things, but I'm just trapped in this regulation. And so the regulation also has one of those natural rights bits, right? Where you're always going to have people fighting. You're always going to have people who have different appetites for risk and different appetites for risk in their activities. And so companies will rise and fall due to this. Okay. And this is interesting, right? Okay. It is often argued that the lion's share of the returns on empire flowed to a tiny group of politically influential investors. But the effect of mass migration to land-rich, labor-poor colonies like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand was to reduce global inequality. Nor should we lose sight of the vast numbers of Asians who left India and China to work as indentured laborers. Perhaps as many as 1.6 million Indians emigrated under the system, which lay somewhere between free and unfree labor. There is no question the majority of them suffered great hardship. Some, indeed, might have been better off staying at home, but once again, we cannot pretend that this mobilization of cheap and probably underemployed Asians to harvest gum or dig gold had no economic significance. Above all, the British Empire was an engine for the integration of international capital markets. Right? Investing money in faraway places is always risky. Less developed economies also tend to be rather more susceptible to economic, social, and political crises. Why were pre-1914 investors willing to risk such high proportions of their savings by purchasing securities or other assets overseas? Because Britain, the British government made this safer. It points out, as a like for example, the British that now you weren't buying, I don't know, Chad widget poppers to pay money with. You were using British pounds in Chad. I don't know if Chad was I don't think Chad was a British colony. You were using British pounds in South Africa instead of the South African rand, right? Instead of whatever the local tribe accepted as money. You know, instead of solid gold bars or a certain weight, you use the British pound, which is backed by gold, but you don't have to carry gold around, and, you know, paper money is much more efficient. You know how much it's worth, and so on. As well, you can get money from Britain to South Africa in the form of British pounds because there's an international capital market. Plus, you know how much gold a British pound is worth, and so on. And this is interesting. The gold standard is usually one of those things that people feel rather strongly about. You know, I think that going up the gold standard was a good idea, but it is also argued that the gold standard ensures the stability of money. You always know that this amount of dollars is worth this amount of gold. Therefore, the value never changes theoretically. But that's not what actually happens in history. Countries dilute their currency all the time. Countries still default because they don't have the gold. You cannot grow the economy super fast with gold because you have a limited money supply. For example. So basically what this book is saying so far is that British colonies became richer after they were British colonies than they were before. Now, this involves a very westernized look at the world, right? This says that the poor tribesmen in whatchamacallit were worse off before the British arrived. Well, no, they had less money before the British arrived. That doesn't mean they were worse off. Very different concepts here. And there's another question asked, right? What if the British had not arrived? What if there had been no colonization? What would have happened to Africa? Would parts of Africa still be like those uncontacted tribes in the Amazon? With no TV, no medicine, no modern medicine, right? No books, no cotton clothing, no airplanes to take them across the world. Would that have happened if there was no colonization? It's a bigger question, of course, but you get to questions about the quality of life and what that's worth. Right? Do you want to go back to living in a tribe in a hut? Were you safer? Did you have more free time or less free time? Were you healthier? Was infant mortality lower? And well, what about the people who lived? What about their lives? What is it the case that a certain tribal chief would have led a good life? And now that tribal chief is some worker on a plantation. Or what if you were enslaved? Certainly your life isn't better. But what about the descendants of slaves? Right? Would you rather be would you rather that your great-grandparents weren't enslaved and you lived now in the Gambia? Or would you have chosen your grandparents to be enslaved and now you live in the United States? That's a very uncomfortable question to ask. It is full of maybes and could have beens and might have beens, and maybe you're thinking, you know what, my life here in the US sucks. Maybe you're thinking my life here in the Gambia sucks. I'd be willing to trade that for the suffering of people who I knew not. But what if, how important is making money to you? How important is it for the possibility of going to Harvard? How important is medicine or freedom from malaria to you? How important is the language you speak? How important is your family? Is your knowledge of history? How important is your culture? Would we have had rap without slavery? We simply don't know, and these are horrible questions to ask in a way, but it's one of those things to really look at. Because particularly, I think we can get held up with the past. We can look at what happened and say it was horrible, and that was horrible, and that was horrible, and we suffered, and we suffered, and we suffered because of it. And my life is bad because of this thing or that thing that happened. But at the same time, the past is the past. That's what happened. That offers some explanation for the position you find yourself in, but it is not a chain that holds you back from becoming something else tomorrow. It doesn't, to an extent, we don't want to be captured by the past. We don't want to remember it every moment. We don't want to live in the past and always suffer because of it. We want to be able to escape the past in all its many forms and go toward a future which is better. Work with the present you have to a certain extent and understand the mistakes people have made before, but also don't reject all of the result of that, because it may not be very pretty, but that doesn't mean it's as horrible in every aspect as you think. That doesn't mean that it's absolutely ugly. It just may have ugly features to it. And, this book doesn't quite give enough leeway to this idea, right? This book is talking about economic growth as measured by money. Is talking about growth measured by life expectancy and so on. Well, what about all the music that disappeared? What about the histories and the stories? What is the value of that? And it's something we still have to reckon with, especially as people who have dealt with colonialism, or the United States who interferes in places, or places who have been interfered with by the United States. And there's accusations flying back and forth and back and forth. Well, how do we understand and respect those feelings, but also say we're not going to let them stop us from moving on and being something different? How do we give play to the past but not be captured by it? It's a very difficult balance, especially because people live a long time. I can say, when I grew up, I was taught about the civil rights movement in the 60s or whatever, and Martin Luther King and all that. And then we watched Remember the Titans in school, and in my head, I'm like, oh, that happened a long time ago. That was way back when. And we got past it now. And then you grow up and you realize, wait, 1960s. My grandparents were alive during that, and they're still alive now. Then you look back and you're going, wait, Remember the Titans? That's based in that's said 1985 or something. 1985. My teachers in high school were graduating college in 1985. Right? You go on C-SPAN, you look at the senators, and you're going, wait, they're all 70. And you're going, okay, so part of their mindset is based on this understanding of the world as it was 50 years ago. I grow up myself, and part of my mindset is still always set in the early 2000s, because that's when I came to an understanding of the world and my politics and the right and the wrong, the good and the bad and the history and so on. And then sometimes you talk to other people and you go, okay, now there are folk who feel differently. Now there are folk who, their worldview, their mindset about right and wrong, good and bad, their mindset about the value of history or money or growth or possibility, or their understanding of how guilty we are and how much we should be controlled by the past, or how much we are controlled by the past, right? I mean, you see Barack Obama being elected, and during that time, hear some people say, well, people won't vote for him because he's black. And I'm going, well, I mean, maybe. I guess, are there still people like that? Seriously? That won't vote for him because he's black? What? But my mother's like, oh yeah, 100%. I totally believe it. She's like, oh, I've seen this. I know this. I'm like, because I haven't experienced that. When I grew up, this wasn't quite the mindset that I expected of America, that I believed it was. But for her, it is, because of when she grew up. And when we go out into the world today, the generation after me has a different feeling about rights and duties and good and bad, has a different understanding about the rules and laws and what should be allowed, like marijuana, for example, legalization. I look at that and I go, this seems like a horrible idea, legalizing a drug in any way. But there are other groups who grow up and say, oh, I don't see what's so bad. We drink. And it's partially it's individuals. Partially it's the geographic area you grew up in. But it is partially also just the years, the age. And, someone who's 5 years older than me, or 5 years younger, or 10, or 15, it's not that much of a difference. But I do wonder, when I am my grandparents' age, how different will the 20-year-olds of my era be? Of my old age's era be? And it's also something to ask when you look at like slave reparations, or when you look at colonial adventures, or when you look at any country in the world who says, well, you did this to me, then I'm going, I don't understand entirely how valid your claims are, right? Like how many of the problems of Mexico are due to the United States? How much should I accept the blame for racism? How much should I be willing to give, or what should I be willing to say in order to change the world? How much of it is my fault? Because it can't all be my fault. It is not all my fault. I'm not demonized. There's always an attempt, right, to demonize you because of your skin color, your mindset, your politics, or your age. And I'm going, no. It's not that simple. Nothing is always some person's fault entirely. Nothing is ever one person's fault. Unless you're dealing with someone who's very young, unless you're dealing with an extreme power disparity. And I don't feel that I have that much power. If I was the president, then yeah, blame me for everything America does during my presidency. Totally. I get that. But, if I was the only white guy and all of I had an ancestor who had enslaved the entire world, then yeah, sure, blame me for that. But really, it's more complicated. I'm a mixed blood here and there. I have different histories. I don't exist in 1912 Mississippi. I exist in California in the 90s, and these are very different situations. So, again, I want to move on, but I also recognize that people are not ready to move on, right? People hold this understanding. People remember. Like, I go and I look at like the Republican Party and I'm going, well, I remember when McConnell said this one thing that was totally hypocritical, and that like informs my view of what the party is. I listen to the Democratic Party saying something. I listen to like Obama's red line. I'm going, well, that gives me an understanding of what the Democrats are. And I'm going, okay, I don't like what I'm hearing in each case. And we want to think that the political party is moving forward. We want to think the world moving forward. We want to think that in 5 or 10 years after the civil rights movement, all the issues are solved and there is no more racism. But it's not exactly the case now, is it? We want to think that, look, you're free of the colonial effort. Britain and France no longer control you. Germany does not tell you what to do. We went to the Vietnamese War, and you're now free of France and the US and China, and you are yourself. So everything you do is now your fault. Well, everything you do once you're independent is your fault. But it's more complicated than that, right? You have outside influences. You have internal issues that are exasperated by effects. You have an ongoing history of colonialism. It's not like every person who was affected by colonialism, died and was replaced by someone who was not affected by all at all once you were independent. But at the same time, you are independent. There's something to be said for taking responsibility for your own actions, right? And how do we balance these push and pull effects? It's unclear. It comes down to individuals. It comes down to an understanding of each particular country, understanding which I simply don't have for many places. Okay. And it goes on, the results of imperial globalization were astounding. The combination of free trade, mass migration, and low-cost British capital propelled large parts of the empire to the forefront of world economic development. In terms of the production of manufactured goods per head of population, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand ranked higher than Germany in 1913. But there is a problem. The performance of the dominions was not matched in the rest of the empire. Here's one of the central conundrums of modern economic history. India, more than any other major economy, had free trade and Western commercial norms imposed upon it. Yet the result was deindustrialization and economic stagnation. But he defends the British here. He says the British deindustrialized India by opening it up to factory-produced textiles. They imposed excessive and regressive taxation. They drained capital from India. And they did nothing to alleviate the famines that these policies caused. Basically, he's saying the reason that India failed under the British is the British did not do enough for India. And yet, he said it's more complicated, right? The Indian historian Tirthankar Roy has shown that the destruction of jobs in the Indian textile industry, that an equal, if not greater, number of new jobs were created in the new economic sectors built up by the British. It's also far from clear that taxation under the British was excessive, since the land tax burden fell from around 10% of net output in the 1850s to 5% by the 1930s. The drain of capital from India to Britain turns out to have been comparatively modest, only around 1% of Indian national income between the 1860s and 1930s. Finally, the famines that beset the Indian economy were far more environmental than political in origin. And after 1900, the problem was in fact alleviated by the greater integration of Indian markets for foodstuffs. The Bengal famine of 1943 arose precisely because improvements introduced under British rule collapsed under the strain of the war. British rule had some distinctly positive effects in India. Increased the importance of trade, created an integrated Indian market, the unified weights, measures, and the currency. Introduced a legal framework that promoted private property rights and contract law more explicitly. They repaired and enlarged the country's irrigation system. They introduced postal and telegraph systems, deploying steamships and building 40,000 miles of railway track. As Roy concludes, the railways, the ports, major irrigation systems, the telegraph, sanitation, and medical care, the universities, the postal system, the courts of law, were assets India could not believably have acquired to such extent and quality had it not developed close political links with Britain. British rule appears to have done far more than what its predecessor regimes and contemporary Indian regimes were able to do. If one leaves aside their fundamentally different resource endowments, the explanation for India's underperformance compared with, say, Canada lies not in British exploitation, but rather in the insufficient scale of British interference in the Indian economy. The British expanded Indian education, but not enough to make a real impact on the quality of human capital. The British invested in India, but not enough to pull most Indian farmers up off a baseline of subsistence. The British built hospitals and banks, but not enough of them to make significant improvements in public health and credit networks. These were sins of omission more than commission. Unfortunately for Indians, the nationalists who came to power in 1947 drew almost completely the wrong conclusions about what had gone wrong under British rule, embarking instead on a program of sub-Soviet state-led autarky, the achievement of which was to widen still further the gap between Indian and British incomes. This reached its widest historic extent in 1979. Basically, what he's saying here, what he's claiming here is India sucked before the British got there. The British got there. They did some good things, education, railways, and so on. And yeah, they did some bad things to people, destroyed the Indian textile economy, but it turns out that they grew the economy enough to replace all those jobs. So some people lost, but the economy as a whole grew. And it's saying that the British left and India just sucked more because India made bad choices. Again, I am not an expert on Indian history, but the claim is interesting, at least. It's hard to evaluate, right? Just in one example of India, with specific numbers given here. Right? Like, I don't really know how much of this is the case. I don't really know to what extent, like, India still suffers under the Raj today, or what the result of that was. You know, the book basically will claim that, you know, the British controlled India with remarkably low numbers of British troops, so they needed a lot of local support, local adherence to their rules and laws. They used Indian troops to enforce British law in India. Then the book concludes in this chapter. Two conclusions follow from all this. The first is simply that in many cases of economic backwardness, a liberal empire can do better than a nation state. The second, however, is that even a very capable liberal empire may not succeed in conferring prosperity evenly in all the territories it administers. With that caveat, we may therefore make what might be called an altruistic argument for the United States to engage in something resembling liberal imperialism in our time. A country like, to take just one example, Liberia, would benefit immensely from something like an American colonial administration. Liberia is one of those countries where nearly everything has gone wrong. Misgovernment, civil war. In 2003, the country plunged still deeper into anarchy following the flight of its dictator Charles Taylor, and the U.S. came under pressure to send troops to Monrovia to impose order there. The fact that as I write this, the American intervention in Liberia is already being wound up brings us to the next, and in many ways the paramount question: is the U.S. capable of the kind of long-term engagement without which the liberal imperial project, by whatever euphemistic name it goes, is bound to fail? Okay, so I'll stop my little speeches there. We go into chapter 6, and I think I can finish this in 2 more sections because there's 8 chapters total, and chapter 7 is pretty easily dealt with. So we'll try and cover chapter 6 and 7 tomorrow. But it's interesting. Chapter 5, he makes the claim, right? He's basically saying, look, sometimes you need a power to control these places and ready them for self-rule. This is very contentious, right? And it is something that sounds horridly colonialist, right? He's basically saying, right, in this last few paragraphs of chapter 5, that Liberia is such a failed country by itself that the only chance it has of rising up the list of economic, of human development, of education, or anything being done for it, is for an outside source to come in and impose rule and order, because apparently Liberia is incapable of governing itself with any sort of growth trajectory. Again, I don't know this. I have not studied Liberia. I have not looked at Liberian history. I do not know what happened to Liberia today. I do not know the effect that America had. I do not know how much support America has given to Liberia, that is beyond the scope of the book. And it's not something that I found a book which talks about it. It's something, to look at, certainly. It's something to ask. But it really comes down to the question of what makes a country be effective for itself. Why is Singapore effective? Why is China effective? Why is Taiwan effective? Why is Saudi Arabia effective? Why is Israel effective? Why is Mexico effective? And these are compared to certain of their neighbors, which are not as effective as regards growth. Why did India lag behind the growth of China for so long? For example, is a question to ask. And these are books I'll read or responses I'll think about, something to look into. And it's a very big, large, complicated question where you get into the weeds. And I'm sure there are, I want to say, half a dozen university professors who look into this, and specifically these issues. I can tell you all about them. I'm also very sure that I will never be one of them. That I'm going to read this book, I'm going to have a few opinions, and I'll keep it in my head as I read the newspaper or a magazine or watch a YouTube video or read the next book after this, and I'll try to put it all together, but I'm going to be the jack of trades. I'm going to just give my thoughts about what is written on the page and view that with a sort of both emotional link to it, but also a steady nonchalance. Because as the book points out, slavery and colonialism, bad, but you can't deny that there is an effect, a very complicated effect that those events have on our modern day. That doesn't mean, however, that that effect must always stay, is the argument I would make.